Welcome back. As mentioned in my previous episode, this one is going to be a little bit different. I'm in the process of completely redesigning my entire world, and that is going to take a little bit. While I will be giving you the Cliff Note updates on the process, a lot of this episode is going to be me answering viewer questions and going off on tangents entirely unrelated to Modpack progression. So, in retrospect, maybe it really isn't all that different. Anyway, apologies in advance to everyone who said stuff that I didn't have time to respond to. There was quite a lot to dig through, and my high-tech selection process was basically just slamming random screenshots in a folder, so don't feel too bad if I missed you. Before we get started with that, I need to get my construction materials in order. My chosen build blocks ended up being some bog standard nice monochrome block called Cubit, and I will probably end up mixing it up with some glass and chiseled glowstone and celestis or something. All that said, I basically need 3 ingredients to get started, the first of which being stone. Stone continues to be incredibly easy to get just by strip mining my pocket dimensions, so that is not an issue. The second ingredient is glowstone. For a hot second, I debated just dropping a few witches on a looting 1000 spike and calling it a day, but I decided that would involve too much effort, so I just made the observation that Botania lets you convert redstone to glowstone in a 1-to-1 ratio using mana. And for mysterious reasons beyond my comprehension, I happen to have a machine lying around that is capable of outputting enough mana that its existence alone constitutes a major threat to national security. Wool can be conveniently sourced by the proper application of my pre-existing weak sauce mob farm, which still nonetheless manages to output a truly concerning amount of string in a short period of time. Fun fact, this is the first time I've actually used this mob farm to produce anything other than Enderman, meaning that it is now officially a multi-use build. It also leaks spiders, chronically, but such is the dangers of having multi-use builds. With all that material acquisition out of the way, I start building and don't stop for like a week plus. So this seems like an excellent time to start answering questions. Soul Kitsunagi mentions that they are trying to spin up a version of the Modpack and are having trouble playing with a friend. And in particular, they're interested in how to set up the void world that I'm using. I see this as essentially 3 loosely coupled questions in the form of how do I play New Horizons, how do I play New Horizons with a friend, and how do I make a void world work, which are all really good questions to ask, so I'm just gonna try and touch on all 3 and minimize the technical mumbo-jumbo as much as possible, because some of these get a little bit complicated. Starting with, how do I play New Horizons? The sucky question that I first have to ask is, can your computer handle the Modpack? Modded Minecraft, in particular old versions of less than optimized modded Minecraft, is a massive resource hog. I'm going to make some serious generalizations here, so take this with a grain of salt, but most likely, if you're trying to spin this up on a school-issued computer, a budget laptop, or a non-gaming midline computer that's older than about 6 years, the game is probably not gonna like that, and there isn't much I can recommend to fix that without dipping my toes in computer wizardry that would be very difficult to provide instructions for. If your computer itself is not a problem, the mod pack itself is a fair bit easier to get going. If you aren't supercomputer friendly, the easiest option is probably to download the Technic launcher and play through that. The Technic version tends to run worse on my system, but it's also plug and play, and you get to skip all the techno-twaddle config stuff that the other options need you to do. So it is an option. To preempt the obvious question, the links for this and everything else I mention when I answer this question are going to be in the description if you need them. I personally prefer to use multi-MC, which is probably a little bit more intimidating at first glance, but it has a lot more stuff baked into it that makes my life personally easier. Unlike Technic, you will need at least a little familiarity with computers to get this working. The Modpack's GitHub page has an entire section dedicated to installation instructions for this route, though, so the best advice I can give you is to read the instructions, follow them, and then ping the Modpack's Discord if you need help. This version seems to run way better on my system than the Technic one does, so I would strongly recommend trying it first if you can. As for playing with a friend, step one is get a friend, so I can't help you with that, but we're going to assume that you've already got that handled. LAN with modded Minecraft is utterly terrible, so unless you truly have no other option, I wouldn't even try doing it. Really, you basically have two choices, and those are host a server or join a server. There are quite a few really good New Horizons servers out there, which is quite unusual for modded Minecraft mod packs, so that is a solid option if you just want to play the normal version of the game. Unfortunately, if you want to do what I do in this series, you are basically 100% going to need your own server, because there is some file editing that you have to do to get a void world, and as far as I know, most servers aren't offering that service for free. The New Horizons wiki has pretty much the single best guide I have ever seen for standing up a Minecraft server, so if you want to learn how to do it, this is definitely the place, but you're going to have to do some homework first, and you're going to need a computer that can host it. As for setting up void worlds, you actually have a bunch of really easy options. Garden of Grind has been getting some attention lately, and there is now a modded version of Hodgepodge out there that you can swap into your mod pack as just a drag and drop replace that will give you the option of configuring void worlds. I fully intend to go this route if I ever do another void world challenge again. Alternatively, the old ways of making worlds manually still work, so with some config changes and a bit of creative mode editing, you can use those as well. I, on the other hand, just kind of went with the nuclear option. I made a regular superflat world in 1.7.10, copied it over, skipped the config changes entirely, and then just deleted a several hundred chunk wide area around my spawn point using an old dinosaur of a world editor called mcedit. It is probably not the best solution, but I already had mcedit lying around and it worked, so whatever. Moving on to some of the older comments, Duct GTNH, what is it with Waterfowl, playing Gregtech, by the way, mentions that they had success using TNT dupers to source mana from Intrapiniums in their Garden of Grind run. I actually considered this when I was brainstorming solutions, because this version of Botania is pre-Intrapinium nerf, but I decided pretty early on that it would be against the rules for the run, so I opted to not go that route. Plus, there's the whole benefit of having mana pylons be kind of a funny bit, which informs a depressing number of my engineering choices in this series, so I just decided that was not the route for me. Len asked if the ever full urn is in this version and mentions that it can speed up flower crafting. It is, actually, and at the time that I was recording that clip, I even had one. I just was being kind of a bird brain and never bothered moving it over. Killer Kilometers asks how I'm handling my newfound fame. I'm going to retroactively insert air quotes there. And what I'm planning on doing in the future. Fame seems like kind of an exaggeration, but I will say that this series has been far more successful than I expected it to be, especially considering that this would be the first series on the channel. So that was a very nice surprise. As for my plans for future content, it gets a little tricky. My first priority is to try and complete Gregtech with nothing, since that's kind of the flagship series that everyone's coming back for. Hardcore RL Craft was me dipping my toes into the water to see how interested the community was in content for it that doesn't involve rabid ape screeching and rage quits, and it seems to be going well, so I will probably finish that up in a few episodes. I'm probably going to be able to fit in another short series before I have to go back to just doing New Horizons. As for what that series is, it honestly just depends on how much free time I have and how much I want to switch it up. Doing two different New Horizons series is utterly unmanageable in terms of the amount of work that I have to put into it, but I am routing another challenge run for it, and I have a couple of deeply unhinged RL Craft ideas that I want to explore on the side. I've also been batting around the idea of doing something with RimWorld for a bit to get some variety in the channel going, or maybe go back and touch on some older mod packs and do just kind of a nostalgia trip and introduce the next generation to what modded Minecraft used to be like, so it really depends on what I'm feeling. As for streaming, people have mentioned it, and I'm kind of in the maybe boat. I'm open to the idea, but For what I do, I feel like it would be the most boring thing ever to watch. RLCraft and RimWorld would be a bit more fast-paced, so I could kind of see myself doing that. But I'm just really not well equipped with my current system. You'll see what I mean in a little bit. So unless there was some sort of massive, overwhelming demand for it, I don't think it would be something that I would do in the near future. Tranked says I sound like a nerd. Yes. Yes, I do. There is a reason for that. Neelam Parsons asked how I upload so fast and says that each video seems like it takes months of effort. For starters, thank you. It's not that bad, thankfully. I'm currently sitting at around 27 days of uptime on my main world, so if you subtract AFK time and add back all the stuff I do outside of playing the game to make this happen, it's probably only going to sit around 30 hours of video, depending on how fancy I wanted to get with the editing. There are some really good reasons why people who do this challenge run either don't record and upload the results or take forever to do their uploads, and it is not because of a lack of commitment on their part. It really just truly is a lot of work, and it's not something that everyone can take the time for. Doge Lord 1866 asks about my microphone setup and how I get it to sound so crispy, and since I know other people have asked me about my recording setup, I use a slightly damaged Talent USB condenser microphone that goes for a whopping $30 new on Amazon. My recording setup is a blanket and some junk I stole from a recycling bin, and also the chair that I normally sit on. And this works way better than it has any right to, and I then just do a bunch of audio mixing after the fact to clean up the recordings in post. I do want to be clear here, like, I do have a job and disposable income and stuff. I just never buy things. Also, I found photos of my parents' cat on my phone when I was writing this, so here you go, here's a picture of him. His name is Jinx. Anyway, John Johnson asked for all of this, and, like, clearly that was a joke, but also, about that... Ogos Hanto Polyglue, sometimes and yes, respectively. Also, these aren't questions, per se, but they showed up in my feed together exactly like this, so I thought it would be nice to point out that I have a wonderfully diverse audience. Alfredeus asks why I hate infused seeds. I don't hate them. I think they're fantastic. The problem is that they are buggy as all heck, and they will corrupt your world save if you aren't careful, so it's less hatred and more pants-wetting terror. Joe Bob Wing asks what the goal of the series is and how far I can get. Basically, there's this endgame prestige structure called the Stargate that's kind of accepted as the end of the game once you've made it, and as long as my pathing and understanding of progression is correct, it should be possible to get that now. So, completion and yes, respectively. Likester Lord asks if I have any advice for playing the pack normally, and points out that Skyblock almost seems easier. I tend to not play the pack normally, so I'm gonna spitball here. The biggest piece of advice I think I can give you is to play with other people. Unless you're doing a challenge run or something with super idiotically restrictive limitations, your single #1 progression bottleneck from minute 0 is going to be how fast stuff can get done, and even just having someone who has no understanding of the technical part of the pack and can just farm beans or hold a pickaxe or something is going to massively speed up your progression. After that, don't get caught into the trap of thinking that the quest book is a shopping list. Like, the quest book is a fantastic resource for people who are trying to learn how the pack works, but it is a stepping stone. It is not the divine authority on how to play the game. And if you follow it to the T, you are going to make quite a lot of suboptimal decisions just because there's so many extra pieces of tech that there wasn't enough space to discuss in the book. As for why playing Skyblock makes the game seem easier, that's because in a lot of really surprising ways, it kind of is. In normal runs, I suspect people try to ignore all of the support mods and stuff that I've had to flesh out and push Gregtech as hard as they can. But when they do that, they forget that Gregtech only ever really solves the problem that Gregtech itself creates, and it kind of sucks at providing solutions for anything else. But because I'm doing Skyblock, I am forced to invest a ton into progressing every support mod I can get my hands on, which means I have this incredibly broad technology base with a lot of solutions that are just straight up better than anything Gregtech can provide. Add on to that literally the only way of producing anything demands, at least in theory, some sort of easily scalable or automated process, and you kind of end up with a situation where progression is slower initially, but once you get going, everything is already automated, and a lot of the so-called mid to late game problems are just kind of solved by virtue of you having no other option. Dark King wants to know what my background in modded Minecraft is. Basically, if it was in a mod pack anywhere from Minecraft 1.2 to Minecraft 1.12, I have probably at least dabbled in it, but after that, it gets real spotty. So a little bit of modding history for you. The Aquatic update in 1.13 did to the modding scene what the Combat update in 1.8 did to the PvP scene. And the end result was this dead spot where all the modded content had to be massively reprogrammed. So for a while, mod packs really were not that good, and they only had like the 3 half-complete flagship mods and about 30 bazillion bloatware cosmetic fluff pieces in them. And I just kind of dipped at that point and started playing older packs. There is some really good stuff out there now, though, so I might have to start getting back into it. The Tall Pancake asks if I have any contact info, and the answer to that is not at the moment, but soon. I am personally kind of bearish on the idea of providing contact info because then I'd have to actually, answer the contact info. And given my personality, it's honestly a coin flip as to whether I would hyperfixate on doing just that or straight up ignore it. So that probably is going to change in a bit because a certain birdie in my life, who is also basically responsible for this video's existence, by the way, you should thank her, has been quite adamant about me providing said contact info, so yeah. Zayjow asks me to acknowledge their existence. Hi Zayjow, it's good to have you here. James asks me how long I've played Minecraft for and notices that I have some super archaic building tech in my arsenal. I started personally playing the game sometime around 1.2, so 12 years and change? If you want to go all the way back to when I first started getting super into Minecraft in general, I'm pretty sure it was a few weeks before the Nether started working in multiplayer, so closer to 13, I think. Eats Road would have been pre-full release, though, so I probably was not around when it was popular, but I most likely would have been exposed to it at some point. Quack Quack recommends that I give Factorio a try and says it might be a good fit for the channel. There's actually a lot of people who recommended Factorio, and I do agree that it would probably be a good logical fit, but there is kind of an interesting point to be made here that informs a great deal of why I do what I do. And that point is that I have actually played Factorio before, and I straight up do not like the game. To be clear, I think it is a good game, but my experience personally was very much this kind of depressing loop of have a problem, instantly solve it, and then waste 3 hours implementing it. And for me, most of my enjoyment comes from doing these deep technical dives and hacking these unexpected edge cases that games have to solve problems that were never intended to be solved in that way. So I see automation as more of a tool rather than an end goal. And every engineering game on the market, Factorio included, to me, seems to miss that entirely in favor of just giving you a laundry list of solved problems and telling you to start grinding, which is just not as enjoyable. This is a question that was on RL Craft, but that's fine. Goldian asks if I've ever listened to Disaster Piece. I have now. Not really my style, though it's nice to know I'm not the only one who appreciates portomantic puns. Hack and Slash is interested in knowing just exactly how hard primordial pearls are to get. I don't actually know, because when I farmed mine out, I just sort of threw hands at the problem and let the system run on its own for a couple days and called it good, but I can probably get you an estimate. Because we know the probability distribution of loot bag drops from mobs killed with looting 4, I can tell I had to kill around 2,000 mini-boss mobs. My system was only spawning around 1 zombie a second because dynamism tablets just really suck for killing things. So if I just plucked a number out of the air and say that mini-bosses are a 1 in 50 chance, getting a Primordial Pro probably should take around 16 hours of uninterrupted grinding at that rate. Ross Davis asks what was added with the new update. There's a lot of things, but the only ones I really care about were the endgame recipes and the improved performance. Mostly the improved performance. I was playing on 2.5.1 Java 8, which is not a super great combination, and between switching out to Java 21 and updating to 2.6.1, I got like a 20 to 30% frame rate boost. It is astounding. Okay, wants to know what I think the most important thing I have cut from the series is. That is a tricky one. I don't really cut anything because of how I script the episodes, so the end result is usually I just have little tails of footage that I don't need. But there are a bunch of things I wish I had done differently or put a different spin on, which is about as close as I can get to answering that. To give you an example, look back at what happened when I was trying to get looting 160. From early on in the video, I load Chekhov's gun and mentioned that you can make mana out of void putty. That gets largely ignored until I'm ready to pull that trigger later when I explain that I need to uber enchant to looting 200 or whatever I tried to go for. I start automating void putty and then the episode ends. Next episode, I do this big old build-up to what I legitimately thought was going to be a solution. And then, right at the finish line, you see me realize in real time, wait, I forgot to test this, and it doesn't work. Now what do I do? So then I pivot, and the rest of the episode just kind of jumps the tracks to finding a solution. Like, I think I spent something like a fifth of the video just doing math and running quick and dirty tests on all of the Botania flowers so I can go, nope, that won't work, or, well, it would maybe work if I got 4 million saplings. So I then do find a solution, I get it working, and then in the next episode, someone hands me a solution that's just like 10,000 times better, and all the work ends up being about as useful as helium paperweight. So I wish I had put a different spin on this, because this is one of the rare instances in my series where I don't just ape the powers of storybook protagonist engineer, wave a wand, and the problem is solved. The reality, and the lesson to take away from this, is I mess things up. A lot. You just don't get to see it. And that kind of ties into something that I've seen on the internet a lot, where everyone seems to have to be wonderful and perfect and fish golden horseshoes out the toilet each morning. Life straight up just does not work like that, and I think we could stand to remember that more often, and I really wish that I had been able to look ahead and go, wow, this looks like an excellent teaching point. But anyway, as for cut footage, no, not really, because I usually only record what I need. Neelam Parsons asks why I needed the looting spike to ensure an item drop. So, a solid 30% of it was just because I think the idea of looting 180 is absolutely hilarious. But ignoring that, interacting with the book that I get from those mobs is the only way to unlock quite a bit of Thaumcraft research and get a hold of mob spawners, and those mobs have a super low drop rate naturally, so I needed something to bolster that drop rate up because I only have 2 of them. It's not stuff that I really need to progress the game per se, but it is stuff that is very nice to have, and you'll start seeing that in the next episode, most likely. Lucas Albert inquires, how long have I spent in my test world, and is there anything that I would never do to my live world? My current test world has like 28-something hours clocked on it right now, but that doesn't really tell the full story since I corrupted and deleted my first one like halfway through the series. So it's probably about double that. Add on to the fact that if it's something quick and dirty, I will usually just mess with it on my live world, so that estimate really just kind of goes out the window. As for things I'd never do in my live world, yeah, there's a ton, but if I want to do destructive testing on a live version of my world, I'll just copy it, so it's never really been a problem, and I've never had to worry about permanently breaking anything. Avilion asks when my first time playing New Horizons was, and when I started playing Minecraft, and if I have any other favorite mod packs. New Horizons is tough, but I want to say 5 or so years ago. I was still a Technic user then, so it would have been pretty soon after the mod pack started getting posted to the front page. Modded Minecraft in general is even harder because my memory is terrible, but probably only a year or so after I started playing regular Minecraft, because I was putting together my own mod packs in 1.3. As for favorite mod packs, probably Big Dig, simply because of the nostalgia. That pack was unplayably broken, and I loved it, and I put like 3 years of my life into it. Zach asks if peaceful trees spawn ocelots in a jungle biome, and points out that the cat saga took like 3 episodes. They should, yes, but also you don't need them if you have a jungle biome, since the biome will passively spawn them, so that doesn't really help. The problem at the time was that I was in a super flat world that was 100% plains, and I had no way of changing the biomes with the technology I had at the time. Toxids asks if the crystal ball from Witchery can be unsoftlocked, and if it has any practical use. Also, as a side note, there are no stupid questions. If you don't know, you don't know. The answer to your first question is yes, but I would need vanilla coal ore, which can be done, but is kind of tricky because I'd have to make a custom Plucket Plain biome that could spawn it or something. Gregtech coal ore just doesn't work. As for usefulness, not really. Witchery is kind of not super relevant at the moment, if it ever was at all, and the one reason I might want it, which is dungeon loot, can be done better with Luniums now, so there's always a chance that it will have some weird edge case that I need to exploit, but it is not likely to be of any practical value. Umberto asks if over-enchanting loot bags works, and does it have any effect on the drops. I actually had no idea, so I had to check, and it turns out that you actually can over-enchant them. Unfortunately, the extra levels don't appear to do anything, so, 6s and 7s. Mordaxon wants to know if I've ever tried detonating my reactor. No, actually, I've not. Let's fix that. I will leave it to the viewers to determine why I consider this to be generally an unwise idea. This is why I'm so determined to make sure that the things are surrounded in warded glass at all times, by the way. Lakefish has 2 questions. The first is where I came from, which seems like a weirdly common question across the board, and the second is why people don't use AE2 interfaces to bridge pipe gaps. I'll start with the second one because it's easier. My guess is that it has a nasty processing overhead, or is just bad. It might be habit, because in older mod packs missing your modded transport options without using an intermediary tended to be a surefire way to chain crash your game with mystery Java errors, so I personally still catch myself doing that even if it's not necessary. But my guess, honestly, is that it just doesn't work very well. AE2 is great for general purpose automation, but if you want really snappy systems, bespoke Gregtech is the way to go, and mixing the two tends to bring out the worst of both of them. As for your first question, a lot of people seem to be asking various permutations of how I got so big so fast, or how I'm so magically good at Flavor of the Week. I know that sometimes it's hard to tell if I'm being serious, so I want to make this clear. I am being entirely straight with you when I say I don't know. From where I'm sitting, everything I do is 9/10 psychotic goblin energy and 1/10 me ramming my fist through the send button at hypersonic velocities every time I did something that doesn't immediately look like garbage. To kind of frame what I'm working with here, this channel exists because I got bored one day and thought it would be fun to make YouTube videos. So I picked the first vaguely original idea I could come up with, slapped OBS on my computer, and went with it. The OBS recordings immediately turned into mashed potatoes, so I pushed some buttons the internet said would help through a data center's worth of computer resources at the problem, and have never looked at those settings since. Y'all have already seen my audio setup, so no additional elaboration necessary there. Until this point, the only experience I had with editing came from making tutorial videos in Microsoft PowerPoint. and I decided that editing my video clips by inserting them into PowerPoint slides was too ghetto, even for me, so I downloaded DaVinci Resolve, and despite having quite literally never used a video editing software in my life, managed to produce something approximating a proper video after about 2 days. After that was done, I uploaded it, spent 5 minutes making the lowest effort thumbnail you can imagine, typed a bunch of fun-looking words in the description, and repeated that 10 more times with slightly decreasing levels of dysfunction until one of the YouTube data center hamsters had a heart attack and the resulting rounding error accidentally turned me into a functioning channel in about 2 weeks. Ava B asks what the closest I have been to giving up or quitting the series is. I wouldn't say I've ever really wanted to give up, but there were certainly some bits that I really, really wished that I could have skipped, and it shows. Bees were bad for a lot of reasons, but I already touched on that quite a lot. Thaumcraft research and warp management was also pretty bad, but I was lucky in that I could do other things while that was going on, so I wasn't really gated out of anything. Honestly, the worst part was probably just getting my first sapling. I was stuck on an island with no other option but to leave the camera running and hope I got lucky, and there was no way of engineering myself out of it. It was just days of grinding. That said, I also had those episodes done before I started the channel, so if I hadn't been able to hack it, y'all wouldn't have known. So I'm not entirely certain if that counts. Jacob says that I should have combined velocity and potency lenses on my spreaders. You are entirely correct, since doing that increases throughput like a lot. It's like 50% or something ridiculous. But one of those unspoken things I never touched on is that my farm systems already could not supply enough eggplant, so I couldn't really benefit from having better lenses anyways. Sasa Worker wants to see me do a scuffed solar boiler setup and mentioned that it scales weirdly well into the late game. It's funny you should mention that. I have a future challenge run idea that, depending on how I route it, might force me to do exactly this. It's still very early on, but you might just get your wish. Susil asks why I use storage buses instead of export buses for my ore setup. Entirely because of their filter capacity. Export buses only accept 9 items, storage buses let me program in 54 for the added cost of a little bit of jank. Creep TV asks how I've gotten so far without a crafting setup. The answer to that is I actually don't do much crafting that would be worthwhile to automate. There will definitely be changes to that philosophy in a bit, but for now it just was not worth the time and the resources. They also ask why I use import and export buses instead of interfaces, because interfaces are significantly more expensive, and I have used like maybe 2% of my channel capacity. Also, all of my interface is single channel, single block face stuff because of how I built my multis, so even if I did go that route, it really would not save me anything since I'd be using them in their panel form instead of their block form. To clarify Greyduster's point, I meant restrictions in the sense that I can't use it to put projectile protection on a hoe or sharpness on a block of dirt or something. The ritual doesn't care about the level of the enchantment, which is why I'm interested in it, but it does do sanity checks on what type of enchantments can go on what type of item. Blue-maned Hawk asks if I think the mod pack or challenge is any fun, what problems I've encountered, and what I would change in general and for this specific challenge. Do I think it's fun? Yes, absolutely. As for problems that I've encountered and things that I would have changed, that gets tricky. So you gotta understand, this is not how New Horizons is supposed to be played. What I am doing is so far from what the mod pack was designed for that it will utterly obliterate anything resembling game balance in both directions of the middle. Case in point, it took me like 2 episodes and 50-something hours of gameplay just to get a single block of usable wood. In normal Gregtech, it really should take about 10 seconds. But, on the other hand, by the time I hit HV, I already have enough automated resource production that I could casually chaincast Summon Mega EBF, which is not a normal part of the game stage for that tier of voltage. So, for normal, non-void runs, what would I change? Botania still feels kind of weird and underutilized compared to the rest of the support mods. Like, there was a lot of work to flesh out mid to late game support mod content when it was added, so it makes sense why it unlocks so late. But the end result is once you can actually start doing stuff with it, most of the things you can do with it are obsolete. Thaumcraft pacing isn't bad, but it is still weird, and it's only something I noticed once I started doing this run. The idea with Thaumcraft is that everything pre-infusion is MV and most things post-infusion are HV, but if you know what you're doing, you can do like almost everything using MV technology, and then basically nothing happens of importance until you get Icorium and your late game wand and armor upgrades. It's not unbalanced exactly, but it's kind of jarring, and I feel like there would be a case to be made for introducing some harder HV and EV requirements just to smooth out its progression arc. Blood magic kind of has the opposite problem in that you basically can't do anything with it regardless of your tier until you get the Well of Suffering, but after that, it's really, really well done. So I'm not certain how or if you would even want to fix Well of Suffering and risk breaking the rest of its design. So mostly support mod stuff, but honestly, the pack is so well fine-tuned when you're using it in its normal state that there aren't really any glaring issues to touch on. For things specific to this challenge run, it's kind of hard to say because like the whole point of the run is this stupidly difficult struggle. If I could wave a magic wand, I would definitely want Void World generation options made available so that people could try it out without hacking their game. And I would definitely also want at least a few quests, even if they didn't give you rewards, just to kind of guide people in the direction of, here's how you do all these weird edge case things to progress. As for changes, mostly just stuff to fix RNG being able to mess with you or fix some of the soft locks that you can get. I'd want to change the main story quest for Sulfur and Thaumic Shard ores to accept refined resources, because otherwise you just can't progress until EV for no good reason. You can soft lock if you don't get a princess from your Traverse to quest reward hive, so I definitely want to either up the princess drop rate to 100% or give you an option for purchasing those that is not dependent on luck. Certain bees are also just straight up unobtainable because you can't complete a quest chain that would let you purchase them, and changing that does a bunch of other things that I'll touch on later. As for stuff that I would add material-wise or changes that I would make to actual game progression, maybe add a quest reward that will give you some oak saplings for curing or killing your first villager, because otherwise you're just beating your head against the wall with RNG or cheating one in, and that's kind of lame, but really I would not change a whole lot. Human Person recommends that I use an uncrafting table. They have been disabled for as long as I have played the Modpack because they utterly broke everything, and I'm not entirely certain that I could get the stuff I'd need to make one anyway. So, it's an excellent idea, but it's also kind of a swing and a miss. Zach Frank recommends a modded server for members. I actually have a ton of experience doing server admin for modded Minecraft, and I would love to do this, but getting one of those suckers spun up and running is a Sisyphusian task, and between the work and YouTube and all the stuff I'm already doing, I'm clocking something like 70 hours a week. So that is something to revisit if I quit my day job, and if I get enough member support to make it worthwhile. But I wouldn't hold out hope. Fishboy asks, English or Spanish? English. Sadly, I picked up like grade school level Spanish in community college, but no one around me spoke it, so I never had a reason to keep up on it. Samsa asks what the deal with airline food is. Well, it has to be cheap, dietarily inoffensive, easy to eat without utensils or an excessive amount of mess, individually packaged, not contain any allergens or socially taboo ingredients like peanuts or pork, shelf-stable for long periods of time at room temperature, and on top of all of that, has to have a flavor that is distinct enough to process at high altitudes because your sense of taste changes in a rarefied atmosphere. So there is not a lot of food that meets those requirements, and I would say that's probably what's up with it. Zaunkönig is surprised that I didn't use open computers to solve the back nuke problem. I debated it, actually, because you could do this in like 10 lines of Lua, but Goblin Brain wanted to do it with Project Red, so I kind of threw up my hands and went with it. And also, open computers in this mod pack is the single most unpleasant, fiddly piece of garbage to get working, and it's going to take a whole lot more redstone before I consider that to be an option. Real Dante asks if I've considered potions of flight since they're craftable with blood magic. I'll do you one better, you can actually craft them out of chicken trophies, and I have a looting 180 spike, so I've got all the flight I need. Kabukamari with a double post asks if the mining drill takes fortune and if super looting can solve lag. The mining drill has a passive fortune effect, yes, but for what I'm using, fortune doesn't matter because all the ores are Gregtech ones. Also, I'm reasonably certain that a looting 17,384 sword would actually cause more lag than it solves. Even spitballing and saying that each level of looting only adds 0.5 mob drops per mob, you are still looking at like 120 stacks of drops per mob, and that will very quickly become not manageable when you consider that even my basic mob farms can easily drop 4 or 5 mobs a second. Replying to Stirline, yes, more mining drills absolutely would speed up the mining process, but the bottleneck is my ability to process refined material, and by that point I will have better options for mining. This is another one of those situations where the chain of dependency kind of goes off the end of the screen, and I end up doing something that looks super suboptimal, but is actually a well thought out decision. As for item pipelines, they are just cheaper, and I didn't want to waste perfectly good ME cable. Giga Atomia. Would I consider playing a pack built around Project E? I tend to stay away from Project E. I don't have anything against it in principle, but the problem is every pack I've ever played with it kind of has this issue where all technological innovation gets turned into a question of how many EMC generators can I cram into my render limit? And then I respond to that question with yes, and usually reach endgame in like a few hours, get bored, and quit. So I would consider it, but it would probably not make for a very interesting video. Pink Moo asks a bunch of things I spoke about earlier, but also wants to know how long the series will go on for. I do not have a firm estimate, and it really depends on how much time I spend waffling around on side projects, so I would say at least 30 more episodes, but probably not more than 60. And I'm not experienced enough with the endgame to really be able to put a better estimate on it. Orange Juice asks if I could spawn myself any non-tool item at the start of a playthrough, what it would be. There are some really good options, but let's just get the really broken ones out of the way before seriously answering. Command blocks and custom-coded spawn eggs that spawn villagers that sell everything in the game for a block of dirt seem like obvious contenders. There is a debug item that generates infinite free electricity at any tier you want, so I could also see myself taking that and spawning it in enchanted with sharpness and looting 10,000, because that seems like it would be helpful. But once you ignore all the creative mode items and tools and armor, there really isn't that much that's just passively useful. So depending on the rule set I was playing under, it would either be a dragon egg or an oak sapling. The dragon egg's a weird one, so I'll have to explain that. When you throw a dragon egg at phantasmal bees, which you can get normally, it spawns an ender dragon. And when you kill this dragon in the overworld, Minecraft just kind of loses its marbles, and in this version of the game, it creates a glitched end portal where the dragon dies, even though you're in the overworld. And this does a couple of things. It allows you to generate bedrock out of nothing. It gives you dragon eggs and dragon drops as a consequence, and it also lets you visit the end, because the portal in the end is the same kind of portal as in the overworld, it just has dimension-dependent behavior. Visiting the end unlocks the hardcore Ender expansion questline and a couple of quest rewards, and one of those is the ability to purchase Oblivion Bees. They are used in super powerful bee breeding lines. They also give you the same wax I got from my bee loot bags, which lets me craft the high-speed, high-mutation chance bee breeding frames. On top of all of that, getting to the end is also interesting because there's a mechanic in Hardcore Ender expansion where a rare dungeon item called a Temple Color lets you reset the entire dimension using a dragon egg. This was disabled in regular New Horizons as an anti-griefing measure, but it was not done for game balance. So if I wanted to stretch the rules a bit, I could conceivably get a temple color from Peck Trading, enable that config option, and then use one of the dragon eggs to reset the end to its original state, which would give me an entire dimension of ores and dungeons. So yeah, for this run, a dragon egg, so that I could have dragon eggs, bedrock, endgame bees, end portals, better bee breeding frames, like 3 new quest lines, and depending on how flexible you wanted to be with it, an entire dimension of resources that I could mine and regenerate on demand. Zalian asks, how would I describe this pack to someone with no technical experience in Minecraft? Grug Make Magic Box? Nathan Miller asks how efficiency comes into play with having lots of low-tier machines and why I don't have several setups running at once. So it's complicated and it depends on the machine. I'm going to generalize a lot, so don't treat this like the Gregtech Bible. And I'm also going to ignore multi-amp machines and perfect overclocking because then I'd have to explain the difference between EU per tick, and EU amps, and people would seem to find that confusing, so I'm just not going to go there. Voltage tiers in Gregtech start at 8 EU per tick and go up by a factor of 4 each tier. So 32 EU is LV, 128 is MV, 512 is HV, etc. Any machine that consumes or produces voltage in that range and receives or has a recipe that requires at a minimum that voltage is said to be part of that tier. So, for example, the first electricity-producing machines you can make consume or produce voltage of up to 30 EU per tick. So they are running in LV, even if they're processing a recipe that only requires 16 EU per tick, for instance. Every recipe that uses power has 2 numbers associated with it: the amount of power it takes to complete the recipe, and the minimum amount of power that you need to supply the recipe for each game tick to keep the recipe crafting. So imagine you have a recipe that turns item A into item B. It says it takes 3200 EU at a rate of 16 EU per tick. Since it takes 16 EU per tick at a minimum, this is an LV recipe, since 16 is larger than 8 and less than or equal to 32. But since it takes 3200 EU to complete, it can only consume 16 EU per tick, and there's 20 ticks in a second, so it's going to take 10 seconds to finish this recipe. If I tried to put this recipe in a ULV, which is 8 EU per tick, machine, it would not work because those machines only supply up to 8 EU. But if I put it in an MV machine that can supply up to 128 EU, something interesting happens called an imperfect overclock. Overclocking, it's basically is an incentive to get people to process low-tier recipes using higher-tier machines because then it cuts down on machine spam and lag. Basically, the machine goes, I can supply more than 4 times the power I would need to do this recipe, so what I will do instead is overclock the recipe so it completes twice as fast but uses 4 times as much energy. So then it would feed the recipe 64 EU per tick instead of 16, and then complete the recipe in 5 seconds instead of 10, which is great. The problem is that 5 times 20 times 64 is 6400, so we've just doubled the energy cost of crafting the item, and this gets worse the more you overclock it. This means that the most energy efficient thing to do is spam out a bunch of single block machines that can just barely process the item that you want. The problem is that this turns your game into a miserable, laggy hellscape filled with halls of expensive, slow machines that you have to constantly manage. So usually, the actually most efficient thing is to just eat the energy hit and process it in a higher tier. As to why I don't have several setups running at once, I have in the past multiple times, but usually it's just cheaper and easier to throw more power at the problem, and I have so many projects going on at once that the real bottleneck is not machine time, it's human attention, and I can't paralyze that. Crimson Veil points out that the maximum effective enchantment scaling for looting and fortune is 255.
Are you sure about that?
Ron Reznikov asks a bunch of questions. How did I generate ore prior to meteor rituals? I didn't generate ore, I generated the stuff that you get from ore in a lot of ways. It was mostly mob drops, XP buckets, crops, or electrolyzing and centrifuging, but you'd have to go back and watch the videos to see the specifics. How am I turning XP into energy? Mob XP gets picked up by a vacuum hopper, bucketed, and then auto-crafted to charcoal. Charcoal gets extracted to wood tar. Tar is distilled into a bunch of different gases, and I can burn those gases for power. Right now, though, I'm mostly using nuclear power. Why so much handcrafting? Because automated crafting takes time, and if I only ever craft something once, it's not worth automating. I will automate crafting for stuff like charcoal, where I have to do a lot of it and the recipe never changes, but until recently, I did not have the technology to make it valuable. How much work do you see? Depends on what you mean by work, but probably somewhere around 2 to 3% of it once you include all the research and production time. Why did I actually unlock the Eldritch tab? Because I simped for Icorium and it unlocks some secret tech to let me get mob spawners on a void world. Wowie Woa asks if nuclear power is worth messing with. Without knowing what your tech landscape looks like, I can't say. My world is very non-standard and should not be used to evaluate how good or bad something is, but you're going to need to do a little bit of it because you have to breed thorium anyway, and reactors are really cheap to set up, so if you have the stuff, it can't hurt to try. As long as the reactor is surrounded in warded glass and you follow the instructions, really the worst thing that can happen is you lose the reactor, and that's pretty unlikely. Object Spur asks what I meant when I said it's hard enough to make content out of normal New Horizons. Simple, like 70% of what I do on here is just normal New Horizons. The game does not magically become less slow-paced once I have ways of getting all the stuff that I need from a void world. And finally, Ivray asked me to explain the magic generation option I normally use for power. They say that they have issues with Aurum generators. You nailed it in one. I usually just use the Potentia ones and spam out like 16 of them, depending on how energetic I'm feeling. And then I switch them over to Lucrum, powered by a Wrath Cage at HV and EV. I would probably say biodiesel is just objectively superior unless you have a specific reason to not go that route, but it will work for a little bit. There are other multi-block Essentia generator options I want to play with at some point, but my expectation is that they'll kind of suffer from the same problem that gas turbines do, in that you gotta slam down quite a lot of them before you really solve your problems, so I'm not super optimistic. And that is most of the questions. Stepping back into the present time stream a little bit here, enough of my new base has been constructed that you can kind of picture what I'm working with. The dome is only about half complete, because even for me, cranking out 144,000 blocks of mana glass is a bit of a stretch goal, but you can get the general idea. Unlike my current setup, I actually intend to do decorative and stylistic work with this space, so even though it looks like yet another flavor of superflat factory gore in progress, I'm just going to have to ask you to have faith. Either way, I hope this episode has gone a long way towards answering some of the questions y'all have. I know there were probably a lot that I missed, but I feel like I managed to hit all of the big ticket items. Now that I have permanent infrastructure in place, my next episode is probably going to start seeing a significant uptick in production speed. But as always, we will see. Thank you all for your time, and I hope you enjoyed. The usual support options are below for those who are interested.